our plan for this evening is for each panelist to introduce themselves, talk for about 5 minutes or so on what they're thinking and feeling into this, the social implications of existential psychology and how it can be relevant for our current times and help with various things we have going on around the world. And you'll hear some chimes now and then because we're still admitting people in. Then after each panelist has kind of done that, the panel will have a discussion, a free-flowing discussion. I'm mostly going to serve as a facilitator just to kind of help everybody get going. And then we'll do that for about 45 minutes total. And then for another 45 minutes, we're going to open it up for everybody because I think the goal is really to have a dialogue and a connection and hear everyone's thoughts. And when we get to that point, I'll kind of ask people to raise their hands so that I can, sometimes with Zoom, it's hard with people talking at the same time. It can get a little wonky. So I think that's how we'll do it. And I would like to have Dr. Schneider, Kirk Schneider, kick us off. And please, Kirk.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and welcome to you all. Chris asked us to give a little introductions, so you know my name at this point. I never know where to begin or end with these, but basically, I've been around the field for quite a number of years. I actually graduated Saybrook University, then the Humanistic Psychology Institute, about 40 years ago now. And I had the great privilege of being supervised by and having mentors named Rollo May and James Bugental, and began at a time where these founding figures were in their, ripening elderhood. And in any case, I felt a deep resonance with them and have long been fascinated by life. Goes way back to my early childhood, actually. And I often say I was introduced to existentialism as a small child when I lost my 7-year-old brother when I was about 2.5 years old, and my whole world was turned around. So I was open to big questions about life from a very young age, and I'm extremely fortunate to have mentors and therapists who have helped me to work with that upheaval. Well, speaking of upheaval, I thought I'd begin with literature. Sometimes the literary is as insightful, if not more insightful, on the big questions of what drives us as human beings, what brings extreme behaviors as much or more than what we see in the professional literature. So I'm going to start off with a quote from arguably the most critically acclaimed writer of horror since Edgar Allan Poe, and that is H.P. Lovecraft. And toward the end of his life, Lovecraft concluded, "The oldest and strongest emotion of humankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." I think we would do well to pay attention to this penetrating culmination of experience about what seems most unsettling and upsetting to the human psyche. But I begin with that because I've long wondered what drives people to extreme places, and especially of late, cultural and political extremism, what I call the polarized mind, or the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view. And through my research and my own experience, I've come around to the notion that we erect these extremes. We give ourselves the illusion of power and control and invulnerability. So often because we're terrified of our vulnerability. I think Lovecraft is pointing to it. Great existential analysts like Otto Rank have also put their finger on the core problem. And that is our basic terror of the unknown, which seems to me to be inherent in the human condition and in our emergence into life. When we move from a place of relative non-being and unity with the mother and with the cosmos
He hasn't.
to sudden abrupt being and pandemonium without the equipment, without the skills to work with it. So from the beginning, we're starting to be aware of our basic groundlessness and helplessness before the vastness of existence. And so much really depends on how we're met. How are we met by our caretakers, by the culture that surrounds us, and how attuned are they to our inner lives, and particularly our deepest vulnerabilities, our primal anxiety of the unknown, of that which is other and different. And unfortunately, too often in our culture, and I think in many cultures throughout the world, especially power centers throughout the world, we're not very good at tuning into our deep inner lives. And in particular, meeting people in their vulnerability with support and understanding, as opposed to fear and prejudice, much of which is handed over generations and is unwitting, unconscious, but nevertheless has a huge effect on us. And so when we experience something upsetting, we tend to not be very good at working with it, at slowing down, at becoming more present to that which is upsetting to us. Almost like our eyes adjusting to a dark basement, where at first things seem so intimidating and so threatening. But if we can hang in there, if we can stay with it, we begin to see other possibilities and maybe even creative possibilities in what we're discovering. So my point here is that I think a lot of the uncomfortable conversations that we have with each other around cultural and political issues, uncomfortable ideas, go downhill so quickly precisely because the stakes are so primal. And I don't think we recognize this enough when we discuss or reflect on, the major problems of divisiveness and of extremism in our culture and of destructive extremism, both emotionally and physically. And so that's why I've been devoting a lot of time and energy to, with some folks here as well, to attempting to find ways of, getting at this root challenge that we all experience at different levels. But some have developed more of the skills and equipment because of their good fortune, as I mentioned before, of having helpful witnesses in their family or cultures. But I think we really got to get down to addressing this primal terror of the unknown and our sense of groundlessness and helplessness that is in the background of these uncomfortable conversations, ideas, feelings. And I think one of the major ways that we need to do that is to mobilize much more of what I would call emotionally supportive relationships throughout our culture and make them much more accessible, much more affordable, and provide a space for lengthier cultivation of these relationships, longer term, in-depth opportunities to connect in more intimate ways at the emotional level, where we're basically developing a holding environment, as great analysts like D.W. Winnicott put it, that people can internalize and develop new internalizations that improve upon the old internalizations, which tend to be very devaluing, very fear-based. But these are more presence-based, more love-based, and more courage-based. And so I don't want to go too much further into things now, because I know we want to leave time for everyone to reflect here. But that's my big pitch is the need to develop emotionally supportive relationships, both psychotherapeutically, in terms of mentoring, in terms of life coaching, in terms of, let's say, helping in crisis situations, mental health crisis situations, mobilizing the mental health community to support this, and also bringing in a whole area that I've been very involved in, which is bridge building dialogues between people who are on very contrasting sides of cultural and political issues, and clearly not giving the most pivotal tools for folks at that stage of life and within the shortened time that we have to work with people to develop more humanizing ways of relating to each other, but they are nevertheless some very helpful tools to help humanize the conversations, help people see each other more as whole human beings rather than stereotypes or labels, which is, again, the fear-based primal terror point of view. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirk. We appreciate that. So for those that just logged on, welcome. We're talking about the social implications of existential psychology, and each panelist is kind of introducing themselves and talking for about 5 minutes, and then we'll get some discussion going. So Jennifer O'Neill, I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself and talk for a bit on your thoughts.
Thank you, Chris. I'm Jennifer O'Neill, and I am a trauma psychotherapist and entrepreneur. And when I looked at the title and what we're talking about today, of course, having a real life experience happening to where it helps me reflect on the topic had to occur. Of course, that happened. But when we look at just socially what's going on, the polarization, and as someone who I consider myself in a space of like a healer, it makes you question, do you really believe what you say you believe, right? Do you believe that people can heal, grow, and change? Do you believe that in the place of vulnerability, is where connection happens? Do you really believe those things? And when you're working, for many years, I worked with survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, and working on that side with people, we tend to, of course, talk about these things are not your fault. This is the fault of the perpetrator. We will demonize the other side many times. And then I had the opportunity to work with the people on the other side. And I did not think I could do that. I didn't think I could do that. It took a different vocabulary for me, and it made me question, do I really believe that people have inherent worth, that they can change? Do I really believe those things? And can I afford to give this person the same level of presence and respect that I gave the person who was victimized? And I think as we continue to practice, there's always going to be these checkpoints where we have to check in with with ourselves. Am I practicing what I preach? And when I tell a client that I'm an existential, humanistic, transpersonal therapist, am I really embodying that? So doing that check-in, I think is so important, Nick, that you keep doing that. And when I was able to look at this human being that has caused harm to another person, I was able to humanize them and give them the same benefit that I give all of my clients. This benefit, this gift of, I'm going to sit here and give you my presence. I'm going to create this space where you're going to be seen and heard. And I'm going to do that in a non-judgmental way, because being in the space itself is healing, right? Being able to give that piece of yourself to another human, and that person say, I didn't think I had any value, but because you think I have value, maybe it is true. And when I learn to value myself, I can then value the life of other people, right? So this, when dealing with a lot of the polarization, working with clients, that was something that I've had one experience after another, where I have to check anytime I'm working with a new population, right? I have to keep checking in all the time. Am I really embodying what I say, right? And if I'm not, this is an opportunity for me to heal, grow, and change, right? Because there's inherent biases, things that I'm not really, that are not in my forefront, that I'm able to see, right? So these are all good checkpoints for that. So the fear of, I don't want people to think that I am discounting the experience of someone who's been victimized. I had to let that go and say, what is my role here? My role here is to create this place, this space where if anyone comes into that space, it's an opportunity for them to see themselves, to be able to grow and expand and reach something they may not even know exists. That's my role here. And hopefully they can heal things from past wounds. They can heal ancestral wounds. They can also stop from doing harm to other people. Right. So those are some of the things that came up when I'm like, okay, we're going to talk about this, because it's so easy for people to say, well, how can you work with this person when you work with that person? Or how can, right? So it's not my job to necessarily fix, it's not my job to fix anyone, but to create that space where they can do that hard work, and that space where vulnerability can exist, where they have that opportunity to heal, grow, and change. So the question I would leave with everyone is, do you really believe what you say you believe? Right? Do you really believe it? If you're tested and you say, oh yes, I have, I'm an existentialist. Yeah, okay, but do you really believe if we threaten If you become threatened in something that you hold very dear, do you really believe it? So that's the question I would leave us with.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, very powerful. Let's see, Gaspar, can you introduce yourself and talk for a bit?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to you all for being here. It's a real pleasure, and I'm very grateful of being here with you. I'm an existential therapist from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I've trained in humanistic existential therapy, relational psychoanalysis, and there's an interesting fact for me that I've worked for many years also as an international politics journalist, which makes me particularly interested in these issues. So I'd like to start by talking about my own experience right now. In Argentina, we're having a very strong political polarization, which is not only present in political discussions, right? It's really it's like very much rooted in our quotidian social relationships. So I have a lot of friends that have had debates, strong debates, and that stop talking to themselves, to each other, also family. There's a very strong polarization between conservative, let's say individualistic, a conservative individualistic view, and another collective progressist view, and each one of those polarizations blame the other for all our problems. We are in a very strong crisis. I don't know if you have some news about that, but it's a very complicated moment for the last 5 years or so, or more even. And it is very surprising to see how each of the positions blame each other without recognizing their own responsibility, right? And I mean, it's a sort of childish and dangerous us, them, good, evil viewpoint. And as Kirk was mentioning before, I am very much inspired by Kirk in general in all my reflections and views. It has to do with our, I could call it also an addiction to certainty. So it is very tempting sometimes to be polarized and to have that polarized view of things, because it is then when we don't risk what getting in touch with otherness and with mystery means. So navigating the unknown, it is very tempting. I can recognize in myself that sometimes I've been also near to polarization, and I feel it very present in the everyday life in Argentina, but it is very present in the international discussions. I think that in the US, for instance, there's also a very strong polarization right now in elections, etc. And well, we know that although Middle East conflict is also having this sort of strong polarized conflict. And the other thing I'd like to mention is that social media and the virtual world in many ways is a blessing. We are able of doing this, of having this meeting right now from Buenos Aires, from the US, and so many parts of the world. But there's also some dynamics that do facilitate and multiply polarization, such as connection, the immediate connection and disconnection we can have with each other, with sort of a distance of our emotional responsibility of what we say, what we do. We can see it in Twitter, we can see it in TikTok, that there's so sort of a facilitation of automatism, of objectification, of, I mean, algorithms reduce the world to ourselves, right? We're having more information about our partial view of the world, and each time it is more reduced and more reduced in a sort of narcissistic vicious cycle. So I have the feeling that this technological reality isn't helping us and does multiply polarization. And this has to do with the lack of, I mean, not complete lack of, but a very strong focus in the I-it relationships, and a difficulty of the I-thou encounters. And this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, and what Kirk was saying about how this has to do with not only a fear of the unknown, but I have the feeling that it has to do already with a phobia of the unknown, of mystery, of the other, and of otherness within ourselves. So, and it was very interesting to hear Jennifer right now, because I never had the situation of listening as Jennifer is doing to people that have done so much harm to another person. But I have the feeling that that would be otherness for me, a very strong otherness. And it's very interesting how Jennifer put it in her disposition to listening, that I have the feeling that that's what existential therapy and existential psychology in general has to give. And it's not so simple as one thinks, right? Listening, okay, so you just listen to the other, not really listening. I think that we try that. It's not always possible, but I think that we try that when we are working in therapy every day. And there's a beautiful scene of, I don't know if you know the novel Momo from Michael Ende, that is about a girl that at some point she it is explained how she is a great listener, and she would listen to people without saying anything, but really listening, and they would feel better, at the point that, for instance, there's a part when a boy takes a bird to her that isn't singing uh, since a very long time, and she just sits listening to him in silence, I mean listening to the silence, right, for a week or so, until he starts singing again. So I have the feeling that what we can give as existential psychologists, and what we are called to give, it's not that only that, I mean, it's what we can give, but I have a feeling that it's a need. There's a need right now of existential psychology, and of a commitment of existential psychology, is this presence, right, with the other, that there's a real lack of it, and the possibility of experiencing and integrating paradoxes, as Kierkegaard also puts it in much of his work, as Kierkegaard put it, as Heraclitus also put it. So this possibility of being present and exploring otherness in an inter, an intra, and a cosmical way.
Thank you, Gaspar. Tyler, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and all the other colleagues of mine on the panel this evening. Some wonderful things that have been mentioned. I'll keep this brief because I don't want to repeat too much of what's been mentioned so far, and I'm happy to go after Gaspar because you mentioned a few things that I will touch on briefly, mainly the I-thou relationship. I'll just say, so I'm Tyler. I'm a student at Saybrook University along with Chris. And I know Kirk Schneider. I reached out to him on LinkedIn after he had posted something last summer. And now I work with him on the core of depth healers. So there'll be two things that I'll focus on today. One is introducing the core of depth healers and how that relates to our topic this evening, as well as focusing on how a particular thing comes to be, and in this case, social implications or social crises. So not as much about what they are, but how they arise. So first off, when talking about existential psychology and social implications, I think it's imperative that we also address the question of how a particular thing came to be and where that started. And I'd like to start briefly by discussing something Gaspar mentioned, is Martin Buber's concept of the I-thou relationship. So this idea is not just about tolerance of the other, but it's also an appreciation and wonder to co-create an experience. To borrow from the concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, and you are because I am. So this can be found in things like nonviolent communication and the experiential democracy dialogue that Kirk mentioned. And so addressing the root causes of an individual's maladaptive or problematic behaviors and the effect it has on their ecological system, to borrow from Bronfenbrenner. And for those that aren't familiar with this, you have the individual in the center of the circle, and you have these concentric circles going out. There's the microsystem involving family, schools, and peers, and this grows further. So we have what is happening. We have how did this come to be? Now, what do we do about it? Well, this is the goal of the core of depth healers. And one thing that I'll be doing is creating a certificate program for qualified professionals to complete a training module. And this will equip them with depth psychology tools to address social crises from various angles. And I'll get into that a little bit more. I'm going to jump around a little. Again, I don't want to repeat too much of what's been discussed. Another concept that I want to talk about briefly is this idea of the polarized mind. We see that Kirk's talked about that quite a bit. And the polarized mind is a mind stricken with an absolutist point of view, to the utter exclusion and even demonization of all others. We see this in politics. We see this in discourse. We fear the other. We don't leave any room for a competing view from ours. And frankly, it's quite a disservice. It's not only dangerous to our psychological health, but as I said, it's quite a disservice to humanity and our potential to become fully realized humans. So, returning to the question of what do we do about this? again, to borrow from my colleague Kirk Schneider, beginning in childhood, we need to enable children to experience the daunting as well as the comforting on their evolving paths. We need to address self-esteem at its core through encouraging pause, slowing down, and recognizing that we are a part of something much greater than ourselves. One alternative to polarization is the acknowledgement of life's paradoxes. This includes our smallness and our greatness, as well as competing views about the world. Again, this polarized mind, really big implication. In a view that is culturally bound and irrespective of hierarchy. So just because I think it doesn't mean that it's better than yours. We need to leave room for this competing worldview. Acknowledging life's paradoxes begins with presence, or the heightened whole-bodied awareness of the world around and within. Presence is a precursor to awe, or the humility and wonder or sense of adventure toward living. And from awe, only then can we begin to develop wisdom, in my opinion, the most fundamental building block for a healthy society. So finally, I'd like to mention that next month, the Core of Depth Healers will launch a podcast series called Depth Dialogues, where each month we will interview different guests, talk to them about a few things that they're doing in their work that draw on depth psychology and how they are addressing social crises that we face today. So I'm going to just wrap it up there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tyler. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to talk for a couple minutes, and then I think we'll go to the portion where we open it up to everybody. So what we'll do is I'll talk for a few minutes on my take on some things, and then everybody can kind of raise their hand and we'll get the whole dialogue going, because I want to make sure we have enough time for 45 minutes. So having facilitated group therapy for a long time, I should have set an expectation in the beginning that I might interrupt people so that we stay. Because I think we're all going a little over our 5 minutes, but I didn't do that. So there you go. So I'm Chris Bradshaw, and I'm a licensed counselor in Arizona, and I'm in the dissertation phase of my PhD in clinical psych at Saybrook. And what I want to touch on is I resonate with a lot of things folks have already said. And I really appreciated, Jennifer, your question of, do we really believe what we say we do when our back's kind of against the wall and when we're up against opposing things? I feel like existential psychology has this understanding of anxiety, a special understanding of anxiety that I think has big social implications. Because I also practice somatic experiencing, and I like talking about anxiety, nervous system stuff. And I think existential psychology offers this additional take, which is my understanding. Sometimes we're anxious about things that we don't know that we're anxious about. And that's kind of the depth element where, and we don't often talk about that, being around people with very opposing viewpoints can be a certain type of anxiety, right? And how do we navigate that space? So I think that something we can do, I'm assuming most of the people on the call are probably mental health professionals in one way or another. I know we can't diagnose people from afar, but I think we can talk from our knowledge of psychology and counseling and healing. I think we can apply that to social issues, and without providing therapy outside the therapy room necessarily, I think we can do things like Kirk and others are doing, where these structured dialogues, which I'll ask Kirk some more about, where we go through a process to get trained in the ability to bring people together that are from opposing camps on an issue and try to facilitate a dialogue of some kind, which I'd imagine doesn't always go well. But, I think who better to try that than people that are trained in therapy and in couples therapy and in family therapy and things like that. Another thing I think that we can do, this idea of presence. So something I see a fair amount of is, I'll just give a very concrete example. You're in a meeting, and as soon as you find the speaker boring, you start getting on your phone or on your smartwatch or whatever, or as soon as they're a little irritating, or they're talking about something that's a different point of view that you find irritating. There's so many ways that we escape being present to each other. Now, what I see a fair amount of time in myself and in others is we escape presence, let's say that way. That's just one concrete example. Or if we resist doing that, we might be there, but then we might start dissociating or checking out, or we might be too agreeable where we're not expressing ourselves. So there can be like this conflict avoidance as well as kind of a passive aggressive type thing with the technology. I hear from clients that have kids that they have a hard time getting their kid to acknowledge their existence and look away from the screen. So I think kind of from a relational standpoint, challenging myself, kind of going back to what Jennifer was saying, to start with being present with the people in my life as deeply as I can, and resisting the urge to tune out, resisting too much, resisting the urge to go to the technology right away. And if there's an issue in the relationship, then finding a way to address it and not avoid that. If they're, you have a significant other and they're venting to you about their work for the 99th time, you've heard the same story. And instead of saying anything, instead we tune out with the phone, or we dissociate and start thinking about our own workday. And it's like, we're not confronting the issue, but we're also not really present. I think that's a start in our immediate relationships. So I'm very interested in this idea of what can we do with existential psychology outside of the therapy room. Those are a couple concrete ideas. And I guess to go back to the anxiety piece for a bit, I've been thinking a lot about, I've been involved in some panel discussions around men's mental health. And I know Dr. Dusing is on the call and he's been involved in that. And something I've been thinking about is this idea of polarized masculinity. I know there's a toxic masculinity that is talked about, which I've certainly experienced. I dealt with bullying growing up and different things that I had to deal with. And I thought more and more about polarized masculinity and about some men, and some of them who are really active in the internet and are drawing a lot of younger men to them and radicalizing younger men that feel kind of lost. And I think of, so a polarized man is essentially, from an existential perspective, potentially, not diagnosing anyone, but potentially terrified of anything that they see as a competing way of being than what they're associating with masculine, which might be a narrow range of what we think of as masculine, as aggressive or controlling, capable of violence, these types of things. So there's a strong anxiety towards being more receptive, soft, humble, listening, those types of things, right? So if I'm working with an individual like that in therapy, or if I'm encountering an individual like that, and we back up for a second, I think something we have to address, or we might want to address with this, is sometimes things need to be opposed also too, right? So sometimes we encounter things that need to be fought or need to be opposed. And I want to have an existential dialectic about that, because I feel like that's a reality, but also part of the problem is like how to know when something needs to be directly opposed and how to oppose it. Because what I see a fair amount of just in day-to-day life, and myself and in others in certain ways, is we can end up feeling like a lot of things need to be superimposed that maybe they don't necessarily need to be. Maybe there's a letting in of the other or allowing in of the unknown and making some space for the other person and not feeling like making some space means we're going to be annihilated. But then how do we really know when it is time to really fight something? When something really is sadistic, uber prejudiced, racist, all these different things that need to be directly opposed. But I'll just briefly summarize. So if I'm working with an individual who I think has some of the polarized masculinity, if I'm in touch with the idea that they're excluding what they associate as the feminine, and I don't really associate masculine and feminine necessarily always with just the binary genders, but let's just say that. That means that there's an anxiety to encounter the feminine, and maybe there's a way to gradually, over time, help them to be present in that anxiety some. And I think that's something existential psychology has to offer, is this set of ideas and ways of being that it's like how do we, with a witness and with support in a holding environment, become comfortable being with our anxiety, kind of dancing with it, and realizing that we can become more fully human. So the toxically masculine person isn't fully human. They're stuck, they've lodged themselves in this one limited thing. And it makes them feel secure, which means, they're controlling. Because the other thing about toxic masculinity is it's really about controlling women as well. So it's feeling threatened by women, so controlling them. All right. So if you feel a desperate need to control something, that means you're scared of something. Right. So working in kind of in that space. So those are my initial thoughts. I just wanted to share some of that without repeating too much of what was said. What I would like to do is open it up to everyone, because that's a big part of why we do this. So anyone that wants to chime in, offer your thoughts, if you just raise your hand, any questions, and if not, I certainly have questions for folks. Let's see. We kind of tossed a lot of things up there. While folks are pondering, I'm going to ask Kirk, would you mind? Oh, wait, actually, I will not ask yet. I will ask Vasilina. Vasilina, can you
Yeah,
jump in?
yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It was amazing. I loved it. Thank you so much for talking and for sharing your perspectives. You know, I think what really appealed to me is Bradshaw's points about we need to know that sometimes things need to be opposed, because I feel like when we are talking about otherness and we want to permit it, at the same time, there are certain places and positions and distributions over there when, there is a clear-cut perpetrator and the victim, for instance. Or there is an invading party, which is Russia, which is my native country, and then the victim, who is Ukraine. And so I'm wondering about the decolonizing kind of therapy, in which the therapeutic mode would be acknowledging this reality, So I just wanted to kind of put it out there. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. If I could just speak quickly to that. This is something that comes up all the time around these bridge building dialogues, and it's a really important point. My own take on it is that the more that one is within the radius of immediate danger, the less these kind of dialogues are relevant. They're not for everyone by any means. You have to be ready and willing to engage. So yeah, I mean, if you're in a war zone, you're protecting your own life, your family, community, what have you. you're not going to engage in a dialogue. I mean, it doesn't make sense. And I agree with what you're both bringing up about certain time to oppose. Now, I don't see it as an either or situation. I also think that bridge building dialogues can be going on with people who are in relatively safe or safer conditions so that some progress hopefully can be made toward some reconciliation. I mean, if people eventually have to come to the table, because if it's constant back and forth, firing at each other, that vicious cycle of polarization leads to nowhere but annihilation, and it's a down spiral. So my hope is that we can reach enough of the critical masses to marginalize more and more those very loud, destructive players, on the world stage and society stage. I think we need to do both.
Kirk, could you, and then I want to come to Dr. Vega, Selene Vega. Kirk, could you comment some on, because in your book, The Polarized Mind, you talk about, I think you talk about some of the world's dictators from the standpoint of being in a state of polarization psychologically. Can you talk some about that? I'm kind of
Yeah, I mean, I think the same basic principle holds from my own research on the well-known dictators, some of whom are living today for sure, that they often come from very insecure and sort of helpless and groundless conditions where they were brutalized as kids. I'm not making excuses for them, but I'm just talking about a certain pattern of victimhood. They were often extremely devalued, degraded, reduced, and it just so happened that these people, whereas some people might collapse under those circumstances and go into the depressive mode, these people had the means and the ability to take the vindictive mode. And so then they attempted to do everything they could to avoid any hint of that earlier vulnerability that they experienced in school with parents, et cetera. And I think what also makes them so powerful is that the society, or at least a part of the society that they're speaking to, has experienced basically the same thing. That's how they perceive their own lives. They've felt extremely reduced and traumatized and neglected and rejected. And they see in the leader a champion for their cause who will put them in that superior position, in that absolutist position. It's not just absolutist, but it has a sadistic element of putting the other down, the scapegoat.
So if I
It
could
can be even
briefly,
higher.
so when you're saying, so let's say you have one of these figures and they destroying any hint of
Vulnerability.
anything echoing back to that. So this uber controlling, dominating everything. We can also see that on a smaller scale in ourselves in terms of if we have a strongly held view and we encounter someone with a different view, and we're assuming this isn't the immediate life or death issue. I mean, maybe the issue could turn into something, but there's something that happens to us. I notice sometimes, at least in myself and a lot of people, is that to take in that opposing view, it can feel very groundless. I mean, I might not like to admit it, but it can feel like a very dangerous thing. So you see these like polarized arguments about issues.
Yeah.
I have my mother is married to a woman who's like a stepmother, aunt to me. They've been together a long time, and we encountered that around the whole gay marriage debate, where when they were attempting to get married at San Francisco City Hall, there were protesters who were pretty vehement and really felt like they were saving something, by doing that. And so we kind of encountered that. We probably didn't thoroughly address that question from Vasilina yet, but I want to go to Dr. Vega too, Selene, and see.
Yeah, I was starting from the same place Vasilina was actually in terms of, I think where I had some reaction was when Tyler Gamlin was speaking about not having any hierarchy of viewpoints. And my thought was, that's fine up until one of the viewpoints is that it's fine to use violence and kill whoever you don't like. And I do think there's a hierarchy that's not okay somehow. It's not to say I can't feel for the emotional state and all of the existential struggle that person is in, but it's not okay to kill people. That's just it. I wanted to say also, I've been part of a group that's been doing something now, we're about to do the 4th time through, of what we're calling inner peace for outer peace. And it's not a dialogue. What we're setting up is a place where we're helping people to connect with their own heart and their own actual feelings around what's going on. We started it around the Israel-Hamas crisis, but it's really beyond that. And it's a space where people can share feelings. We try to make it as safe as possible for that, dividing people into small groups with a facilitator. And it's not about solutions. It's not about figuring out who's right and who's wrong. It's not about dialogue in that sense. It's about witnessing and being able to feel safe to say what's really there in your body and your heart, and have the others who are there witness it and then do the same. And it's been very powerful. I can't imagine getting the dictators in there to do that. They're not willing. But for someone who's willing to go to that place, I do think that's kind of a first step.
So this is something you offer for like the general public?
Yeah, I'll put a thing in the chat. Let's see. Oh, this is just too long. Let me see if I can. Let's see. I'll do it in a couple of pieces and see if I can get it into the chat.
Okay.
I'd like to add something, Chris, if I may. It's very interesting to talk about, do we tolerate intolerance, right? So there's also limits to to dialogue and to listening. The thing is, how do we deal with that? So one way of I'll talk of historical, very extremist situations. Like one way of dealing with Mussolini, the Italian dictator in the Second World War, was a mob hanging him, right? And another way of dealing with polarization, with political polarization, is what Mandela did when he started different commissions of encountering and of integrating the different parts of society in the apartheid, right? I am very sure that we can't mean when we say encounter and being present with the other, that can't mean accepting any given situation, but it can mean a way of also dealing with these unacceptable situations. I think there's different ways of doing that, because or else what happens is what happens in the Middle East, that the vicious cycle goes on and on and on and never ends, right? I hope it will end sometime, but that's my thought on that.
I'd just like to appreciate Celine's comment as well, and to say that actually the dialogue approach that I and others of us have been fostering is very much on the same wavelength. It's not a debate by any means. It's not you're right, I'm wrong. It's all about attempting to learn about and understand the other and giving people space for that. And then seeing at the end, what did you learn? What did you discover about yourself, about your relationship, about the other and the other side? And, is there potential for common ground, which there often is not ideologically, but what we find is that there is more on a human to human level, meaning you find out things about people's backgrounds, about their own wounds that you may relate to, and often just are able to engage with the other, just as Jennifer was talking about, in a much more holistic way than you did at the beginning. And, if we could just learn to engage with one another and be relatively civil, that would go a huge way in terms of our democratic process, I believe. Because we're always going to be dealing with contrasting views. But yeah, I'd like to know more about that process that you mentioned, Celine, as well. And yeah, but just one other point about what Jennifer talked about, raising the question about, our mandate as healers. I like to ask the question of, at what point does our role as healer end and our position as partisan begins? And that's not an easy question to answer, but I think it reflects what Jennifer was talking about. I think it's a good question to pose to ourselves, especially those of us who are healers in the mental health community. It seems to me that if anyone does have that capacity to have quite a range in regard to our ability to heal and work with contrasts and opposites, it's us. We should have that ability. So I think we have a very important role to play in this race against time, in the face of the vicious cycle of polarization. I do believe it's a race against time.
I have a question for Kirk and Tyler about the core of depth healers. Can you kind of explain some about how you think depth therapy could help with these things, and what do you mean by that? And also, because I've heard, and I'm interested in this idea of therapists getting together to kind of donate time to work on some of these things. And I know there's approaches like, for example, I'm training some in somatic experiencing, and there's an organization that individuals can go to kind of disaster areas to help. Of course, I have to think about all the licensure implications depending on where you're being sent and everything. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Or maybe I'll say something quickly and then
Yeah.
give it over to Tyler. What I mean by emotionally restorative relationships, for example, is relationships where people feel heard and seen, and that get at the roots of their problem. Yeah. So in other words, it's attempting to get below the deck on the Titanic, where you're kind of reshuffling behaviors or mentation, cognitions, reconditioning, and really attempting to be there, as I think a number of you have brought out in terms of listening. Gaspar mentioned that it's more than just a passive process. It's an involvement and an engagement and a co-creation of safety so that people can work at those even pre-verbal embodied levels, not just reporting about issues, but learning to be present.
I want to follow up on something you just said, because I think it ties back in with what Selene was saying about helping people to get in touch with what they're feeling emotionally and physically, because I do think, existential humanistic therapy has a really strong embodied element and relational, and so does somatic experiencing. And I think that that's something maybe as therapists and as existentially interested people that we could apply to some of these social issues is what is it like on people's nerve endings, so to speak, when they're dealing with these issues? Is this affecting their bodies, their nervous systems, the pre-verbal, the kinesthetic, and what's going on for us there? When I'm even a more mundane, situation. I mean, a lot of workplaces have polarization or conflicts within the workplace. And I know, Kirk, in your book, Life Enhancing Anxiety, you talk about in work and in school, how can some of these things be worked on? How can social issues be worked on at work and at school, which is where people are most of the time, right? But how do we respond physically when we encounter someone with a very different viewpoint? Assuming, again, it's not immediate life or death situation. But I just wanted to highlight that because I think that's a very big thing. Coming back to what Jennifer was saying, was it's like, do we really believe it? Do we really believe it in our nerve endings? Because I'm going to imagine, Jennifer, that when you were initially sitting with some of these individuals that have harmed people violently, it's a whole bodied, whole being process to listen, and you did that work. And of course, if we could all do that work, things would be pretty different if we could do it day to day. But
maybe Jennifer could speak to that
yeah,
more specifically.
yeah.
Yes, thank you. It was not easy. It was not easy. And I had to put in a lot of things. I had to really pull on my grounding techniques, take care of myself, my spiritual tradition. I had to engage my entire self in order to be fully present, right? So nurturing myself as well. So it took a lot of practice doing that in order to be able to sit with someone and then hear their story. And I had to focus on what are we really doing here? This is not about my role was not to get them to take accountability per se. That was not what we were doing there, and I often would say that when they come into the room, the mirror is there for them to look at themselves and they hold themselves accountable, right? So basically I just needed to create this space, like the space where they could be vulnerable, where they could come in, when they leave their cell and come into my office and cry, where they could be witnessed, right? And what I saw what was common was the idea that they felt that my life is not worth anything, so your life is not worth anything, right? So we spend a lot of time in who determines worth, who determines whether one person has more worth than another. How do we prove value? Like where does all of that come from? So we would spend a lot of time working on a lot of these kind of existential themes and thoughts, and causing them to really dig deep and look into themselves. So where did I get this story from? And once they started working on the story, they started reauthoring another story. And then I started seeing people take responsibility on their own for some of the things that they've done, knowingly and unknowingly. I started seeing people want to even reach out and say, how can I be different? How can I how can I impact change? So, and these are things that I did not have to start the conversation with. I just created that environment and it like organically would go into that space. But it was not easy at all. And there were times when I was like, I don't know if I can do this. Right. But over time, I realized that I saw a pattern, and I would continue to start from that place of humanity. We are humans, and as a human being, what are some of the things that can you recognize your own humanity?
Mhm.
And once we started it from that space, it just would organically kind of move in that direction.
Just to resonate briefly, the Experiential Democracy Dialogue is very much along that path, because before we even discuss the issue, the charged issue at hand, whatever it is, about conservative, liberal, whatever, we invite the partners to visualize what it might be like to engage with one another.
Mhm.
Just to envision that, and also to
Wow.
observe the thoughts, feelings, body sensations, images that come up around that prospect of engaging with the other.
Mm.
So you're beginning with a depth process of getting to know what's operating on yourself, and trying to just notice how you are, so that you're in a better position to then be a better self, with this person.
So a question, an observation, Jennifer, and then a question too, and this is really helpful to me. So it seemed like, my observation, Jennifer, is it seemed like there was anxiety going into these encounters with these individuals, and you went through the anxiety. And now it seems like, I guess my question for you is, how do you feel now, having had that experience or having done that work? How is Jennifer different?
Well, definitely had anxiety going in. I think I built a level of, I don't shy away from the anxiety, right? So I'll lean
Yeah.
into it, and I look at it as an opportunity to learn something about myself, right? So now having done, where I continue to work with both people who have been victimized and people who've perpetrated certain negative behaviors. As I continue to work in that, I have an anchor, and my anchor is always see the person, see the pain, see the person, see the pain, right? So if I get pulled off, I pull myself right back to see the person, see the pain, address the pain, right? And that is one of the things that I use to keep me grounded. And let's be clear, like this, I mean, I'm not always perfect in that, right? But I don't mind saying, like, if something comes up in me, this is about being authentic in the room, right? Something comes up, I'll acknowledge it to a certain extent, right? I'll acknowledge that this is, I'm having this experience because they're picking it up anyway, right?
Yeah.
Right. So being able to just I don't really think sometimes, I know as existential practitioners, we get it, but for the most part, the real strong belief that presence really is healing, right? And witnessing a person can bring freedom, but with freedom is responsibility, right? So that if we really focus on that freedom in that space, responsibility is going to come up. So,
Jen,
Thank you for that.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
No, thank
Chris,
you.
can I jump in for a second?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Jennifer, I just want to point out something you said. I really really think you hit it on the head. And with the responsibility that we have in the room with the client to also to show emotionally restorative relationships, I think it's so important to practice self-disclosure, to show a client that it's okay to talk about something that may be uncomfortable, and to say that to them. I'm a huge fan of Yalom, and Yalom talks a lot about this, and saying it to the client. And if he mentioned something in a book, he forgot someone's name in group, and they said, "Oh no, it's no problem." And his response was, "Well, maybe that's why I don't remember your name, because you don't really think it's a problem." This ability to have self-disclosure, and also knowing how to frame that, and if you have the relationship with that client to be able to do that. But I think that it's so important in our role as therapists to be able to self-disclose. And back to Chris, what you were talking about with uncomfortable conversations,
Yeah.
to be able to say, I know I'm kind of drifting off right now, and I don't know what it is. Maybe it's me. Maybe I've heard this story before. What is that like for you to hear me say that? I think it's a powerful tool that we have.
Yes, it is. And as humans in relationship, and we're talking about the social implications. So as humans, that's something we can bring, right? I want to make sure, I want to come back to Gaspar for a moment, and then I see Beth has her hand up. I'd like to ask you, Gaspar, how are you feeling about all this that we've talked about in terms of what's going on in Argentina, and what specifically at this point in time, because I don't know what I would do in that situation, but what specifically at this point in time are you doing to kind of bring some of this out into your society?
The first thing I try to do is, when I have discussions with my loved ones and with my friends and with a neighbor, I try and not get polarized, because it's really hard to do that here right now. And I try to practice what I'm preaching, and it's not so easy sometimes. Yeah, it's interesting how it is really tempting to get in, to have certainty, right? And to not navigate the mystery. And I'm really interested in the core, the depth healers you were talking about, Tyler and Kirk, because I have a feeling that in Argentina we should try and have some sort of program of that kind. And well, on the other hand, I also write some articles integrating a bit journalism with psychology about this. So yeah, that's my small contribution, and trying to respond to May's call of us therapists getting out of our office and not only be in our offices, and trying to get committed with our social situations.
Thank you. So I'm hearing like your way of being with the people in your life, and also you're making your voice heard outside of yeah.
Yeah, the principal work we do is working with ourselves and with our clients, right? So we're constantly trying to practice this presence, this encounter, and maybe there can be also less therapy and more of those restorative emotional relationships that can multiply from therapy, right? So the client also can then benefit others by learning to listen also.
Thank you. I want to make sure I get to Beth's King, and then Athena. Hi.
Muted. Hi, everyone. Such a rich, wonderful conversation.
Yeah.
I'm thrilled to be here and nodding my head along with all of you. I just wanted to add a piece with regard to polarization and toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
I'm aware, and you are as well, that many of the world's religions, and certainly the major ones in our country, are polarized with regard to gender. We don't have a divine feminine in our culture. As a woman, my culture does not offer me a higher power that looks like me. And that's a problem for me. It's a problem for a lot of people that the dominant higher powers do not look like them. And I've heard David Data suggest that the problem of pornography is actually a twisted shadow piece of desire for the divine feminine. When I first heard him say that, it was in a book, and I literally threw it across the room. It made me so angry. And then I thought about it for a minute, and I picked the book back up and I went, crap, I think he's onto something. I can totally see how that might work. So this esoteric axiom, as above, so below, might suggest that some kind of divine feminine could be a healing counterbalance to a lot of the things we're talking about. How we make that happen is a big question. It's one of the reasons I'm developing some work around this idea of a seasonal psychology that simply follows the seasons wherever you live and connects you to Mother Earth, because the Earth is a form of feminine that everyone has access to and that most people will agree is important. But I just was struck by the idea of toxic masculinity and polarization and its relationship to the fact that most of the higher powers in the world happen to be male and many of them punitive.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for letting me chime in.
Yeah, that's a feast of thought there for me too. Thank you.
It is.
I want to make sure we have enough time. Athena, can you jump in and then we'll all talk again?
Yeah, so thank you so much for this amazing conversation. I feel like anytime we talk about something so vast and something that has so many implications on so many facets of life, like it's just so, it feels overwhelming. It feels overwhelming about attempting to address anything or attempting to make a change, because it just feels like no matter how much a person or a small group works, it just feels like there's so much more work to do. So I just want to take a minute to appreciate all of your all's work, because it is making a difference to the people that you are working with. So I really appreciate that. Jennifer, also, hi. I don't know if you're going to recognize me, but I recognize you from residency. So it's good to meet you. And I appreciated all of your comments too, and jotted some notes from that. And I think it's really important for me to hear what I'm hearing in a lot of people's conversations here in this meeting, is that providing safety is like the key element to a therapeutic environment that's going to be healing, no matter what side of an argument a person is on. That safety is really, when a person can feel that safety, and that safety is something that we can actually create, then that is something that leads to the feeling of presence, which leads to the healing. At least that's how I'm interpreting it. I also just had a query, and I know we're almost out of time, but what I'm hearing a lot of is therapist action towards people who were taken care of, or who so clients, or perhaps like people who have been perpetrators, so clients in that sense of the term as well, or people in the community who feel like they're already, it seems like, if I'm understanding correctly, are already slightly open to at least the possibility of seeing another person's viewpoint in the case of polarization. And I'm just really curious, like, this is something that burns me at night sometimes, is how do we affect all of the people that can't afford therapy, that can't that can't pay their bills, and yet the lived reality of polarity and the lived reality of the dichotomies of life are just literally killing them. Like, and I have my own personal kind of venue towards what I want to do, what I'm starting to do in my life. I want to write. I am writing, and I want it to be like anyway, that's a whole nother thing. But like that's what I want to do. But I'm just curious if there are other ideas as far as like this is all top down, like what can be done from the bottom up to kind of decrease stigma, increase education, and especially increase hope, because I feel like that's what is primarily missing.
Yeah, I can share that something that came up, I'll just share briefly in some of the men's mental health panels that we were talking about was getting out into communities and talking to people directly. It came up in the context of that a lot of men supposedly aren't seeking mental health care and feel uncomfortable with it. And the APA put out some suggestions around how therapists refer to their work and where they meet people. So, I mean, part of what that's just one thing I wanted to say briefly, but I don't want to take up all the time. I wanted to, Kirk, it seemed like you were going to chime in there.
I would just say that I think we need a national mobilization of mental health healers, core of depth healers, to spread throughout the country and provide affordable, accessible, longer term, in depth therapy and relationships for people who are terribly deprived of those, especially people in underserved communities. And I think it should be a national priority, governmental as well as private donors, private support, but something like a Marshall Plan, because I do think it's like a 5-alarm fire. The short of that, I would say, I guess from a very biased point of view, utilize some of the tools that are out there in your community, in your households. Nonviolent communication, Experiential Democracy Dialogue, Arnie Mendel's world work, deep democracy, as he calls it. I mean, there's a number of examples at our YouTube channel, Core of Depth Healers, of that work that may be helpful for you to utilize. I mean, having a mental health background is a huge step in the direction of being able to offer this kind of engagement with people in the community. As long as you adhere to the ground rules, those are key, because they really anchor people around curiosity, openness, and respect, basically.
If I could chime in, Kirk, tying what you're saying to something Beth's said too. So Kirk, you offer a provisional definition of presence, right? And I have it memorized because it's really beautiful, and I feel like it ties in with what Beth was saying, which was also very beautiful, is presence is this complex mix of concerted engagement, appreciativeness, support, expressiveness, and it holds and illuminates that which is palpably significant within the client or the other, and within myself and in the relationship. So going back to this idea of the holding environment, and I'm kind of riffing off this, but that's what you were saying was the divine feminine. And so I'm involved in some training with the Existential Humanistic Institute, and we were kind of gently called out in our consult group about we're doing a lot of illuminating, but we're not necessarily doing a lot of holding. Holding space, safe space, sanctuary, being, right? And that our society in general, or at least in US society, it could be said, is big on illuminating, showing things, telling things, saying things, proving things, winning things. Very, you could say, stereotypically masculine, And what about holding? Sometimes as we know with therapists, or we know, maybe sometimes we know it in quotation marks, but we don't always do it, which is holding space and holding presence and receiving, letting someone in. So it seems like part of what we're doing with this structured dialogues is how can we structure an environment with kind of a referee or someone, how can we structure an environment where people can hold each other a little bit, or can it be in relationship with a holding versus a illuminate, I got to prove. Because part of therapy is also, of course, educating and exposing or confronting, or, of course, but we can obviously kind of overdo that, right?
Yeah.
So I'm seeing this real connection. Yeah.
We're attempting to help people internalize a new embodiment with each other. So, the dialogue process that I'm describing is certainly not just about content. It's about the process of two people relating to each other in a whole new way.
Yeah.
And hopefully developing a new internalization through that.
Which is more similar to what Betts is describing. You go out in nature, a lot of people report when they experience a sense of awe, it's in nature, right? So you go out and what can we learn from a present relationship with nature that we could carry into a relationship with other people or with ourselves? Or
Yeah, what comes up for me, I don't know if you're actually asking, but you're seeing it as it is, right?
yeah.
I don't go to the Grand Canyon and start thinking about other things and projecting it onto that. I am just seeing that beauty for what it is. And how do we do that with the other, with relationships with people?
Yeah, and some people have actually fallen into the Grand Canyon and died from taking selfies and arguing about, they're backing up to the Grand Canyon and arguing about how the selfie was supposed to go and fallen in.
And
really
not
so
not
that sums it up.
arriving to, and Chris, not only, I mean, there's a more subtle way to see it in the sense that if we go to the Grand Canyon and we're only getting selfies and describing how our experience was, we're not really experiencing it. So that's a real problem about technology right now, that we are always trying to be connected and we are never really present with what we think we're connected with.
Yes. Thank you. Dr. Dusing, Chris, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just real quickly, like what Athena brought up, it just has me thinking through a social work lens. Existential psychology, wonderful concept and wonderful to talk about this core of depth healers, all wonderful concepts. I start to think though in terms of nuts and bolts, how do we package this or remix it to make it accessible to other populations, marginalized populations, populations too, that are younger. I think that a lot of change can be affected not in our generation. Sure, we can get back in touch with things and all that, but I'm thinking, how can we adapt existential psychology to be taught in elementary schools and catching the next generation? And that's just a thought of mine. I don't have any answers to that. But I wonder, at Saybrook and other existential institutions, are there dialogues around how to reach the younger generations?
I haven't been in any, but that's a very worthy question. I remember a great philosophy professor I had, Jacob Needleman, who he went into middle schools and taught like some pretty deep, like how to approach like Socrates, kind of how to try to live a little more like Socrates. He brought that in, but I think that's a powerful question. I know Kirk does write about some of that in his book, which is one of my most underlined books of all time. And I said I was going to reread it for this, and I didn't. But you talked some about going into the schools.
Yeah, these are just some very preliminary suggestions, but seems to me a lot can happen around certain readings or viewings of movies and promoting great conversations with kids, about big picture issues, the big issues that come up around life and death, around one's identity. I mean, of course, you got to keep it fairly simplified for the kids, but you can have great conversations. I'm sure many of you have had with your own children, if you have them, or maybe with your parents, where there's a passion there, and there's engagement, and there's full presence and excitement about the adventures that you're reading about, and the trials that you're reading about, and the triumphs. And I also believe in field trips. Huge believer in going to places, go to the museums, go to the concerts, and then discuss them. See what feelings and thoughts come up for the kids in actually participating in new experiences, going into workplaces, finding out what people do in this world. So those are some thoughts.
A little bit selfishly, I mean, I have a 1-year-old daughter, and I'm already seeing the infiltration of technology and the pull to not be present for her, for Lena, and for myself, and for my wife to just be present. It is so fucking hard. And I just want to acknowledge that, because that's where that's actually where I see a lot of the 5-alarm fires going on. I mean, the adults, yeah, everything's burning. However, just watching my daughter interact with the TV or the screens, there is something magnetic about it. And it's so easy to get frustrated and give her the phone to just quiet her so that we can have just a sense of sanity. And that's, again, where I see a lot of the conflagration and fires that need to be addressed. And it's hard not to get demoralized. I also, too, find myself asking questions of how to remain buoyant and demoralized when I see a lot of these crises happening at such an early age. Yeah.
My heart goes out to you.
Being a parent just opens one's eyes. It's almost like the allegory of the cave.
It's a lot tougher now, I think, but I'm just thinking of, some of the long trips I took with my kid, like to Tahoe, and we read books to each other. Well, he would read to me, and then we'd talk about it. Well, so maybe if you could get her to, read something, or someone read to her.
Yeah.
And don't take the phone with you.
Yeah, that the reading with dad might be more satisfying than the book. I want to go to Bets and then Jennifer.
Thanks. We have an alumni of the Center for Humanistic Studies. His name is Ryan Beal. I'll put it in the chat. When he got out of school, he did not go into therapy. He went into curriculum development, and he developed an emotional literacy curriculum for high schools because his brother had committed suicide, and it was out of a toxic family situation that his family didn't know they were toxic, and they didn't know any of the things. And had anyone been talking about anything, this young man could have been saved. And so Ryan basically wrote the intelligence, the EQ literacy program that his family needed but didn't have. He's been shopping it around. Some schools have picked it up. It's expensive, but more excitingly, the Canadian Psychological Association just picked it up Canada-wide. He hasn't had any luck selling it to the APA here, but some schools are showing interest. And if you would like to shop it at schools that you're involved in, I'll give you his info in the chat, and you can check that out. I also I'm hopeful that every generation has its hero's journey. Mine was Star Wars. The millennials had Harry Potter. I think the youngsters now are really liking Percy Jackson. But it's the hero's journey, and it is a way for children to enter into this idea of a quest of honor that involves looking out for others. And that story just seems to come around for every generation. I think it's a front door into things with the younger people.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. Jennifer, can you jump in?
Yes, thank you. I was going to say that, but and it's funny is a lot of times at the TV that they watch, depending on what it is, will have these existential themes hidden in it. And with my kids, I have a 32-year-old and a 13-year-old, so completely different generations. Um and I was fortunate enough where I was able to travel a lot. So I would take my kids to different cultures and we would move around the world. And the education that comes from being in different cultures and being able to learn from people and see how people think and how they practice life, and all of that has so many things that come up to the surface for discussion and so many things that become embodied, you know. And I noticed that my children can have these really deep conversations with their friends. And it had a lot to do with exposure, right? So, and while, many families may not be able to um, afford to maybe take their children, but even having programs where they do take children to different countries, that we give to those programs. We give to those programs so they have money to take children that would not be afforded that opportunity to go and learn from other cultures. So I think there's so many different existential themes that are hidden. And I remember listening to something and saying, I don't even know if my son knows what that means. Like in something in a cartoon, like that's written for adults, but yet children are watching. So they're getting a lot just through that.
Hmm. Wow.
And I was going to say also, let's not forget nature and raw contact with the ground, with the ocean, being
Yeah.
being with nature.
And then maybe also, which I think part of that's you're doing with the writing and everything, and part of what we're talking about is, and then having a discussion about what we're experiencing, perhaps. I guess not always, but especially I remember as a kid kind of longing for an elder to kind of sit down with me and be like, what is it like to be in nature here together? Or, because I think a lot of things can get taken for granted or missed. And the same thing as, as a former literature major and stuff, I don't necessarily like analyzing, dissecting everything to death or anything, but sometimes you can see a movie like Star Wars and miss certain profound things. Might get distracted by the lasers and miss certain profound things about your life. But if you have an elder to kind of to sit down with you, and that sounds so simple, but also that's also at least not done all the time. So that's something we also have to offer, because as therapists, we sit with clients, we slow things down, we notice things, we notice what it's like to be in the room together, we notice little expressions. So yeah, it's coming up.
Yeah, I think that existential concepts are very important, but more important and more existential is probably holding experience, right? What you were saying with a kid, for instance. I don't know if it's so important to talk about existential issues,
Right.
but to hold experiences such as anguish, such as anxiety, and to be able to accompany that person to experience that. It's like what Beth was saying about the hero's journey. Well, it's the person's hero's journey, right? That you can develop and you can experience only if at first you had a holding environment that permits you to then want to adventure in the world.
Yes, and then if we use a language is for the sake of maybe enhancing the experience versus explaining away anything difficult, right? Like if you're a kid and your grandmother has died, and obviously I could see it could be tempting as a parent to, don't worry, you're not going to die, or don't worry, or I'm not going to die, you're not going to die, we're not going to die, or whatever,
Exactly.
I'm not saying that that's just a kind of maybe a silly example, but versus using language to what is it like to be here right now? I remember going to my grandmother, half my family is Italian, so we have a big wakes for like 3 days, and the open casket, and I was very close to my grandma. It was a very profound experience, and it was devastating and yet very meaningful. And I remember one of my uncles being like, just kind of a simple something like, how are you feel? How are you doing? But I could tell by the way he asked it that it was like he was going to sit with what I said.
It was
It wasn't
interesting.
going to be as soon as I said, I'm sad. Well, don't be sad. Grandma wouldn't want you to be sad, shove a cookie in my mouth or whatever. No, like so using language to have it enhance the experience. I think that's something we can do in all of our interactions, right? Versus using it as a weapon to kill off any uncomfortable stuff.
And conveying our passions also.
Yeah.
Modeling expression of
Yeah.
excitement,
Yeah.
exuberance.
Right. Yeah. I know I want to respect everyone's time. I could certainly keep talking, but I know we're at the time that we said we would end. I really appreciate all of you, and I hope that some of you maybe consider doing things like this so we could keep up a dialogue. It is recorded, so I'm gonna post it like on LinkedIn and YouTube.